In this video, we're going to be going over the purchase and sale agreement. Please keep in mind that this video is being recorded in 2025. So if you're watching at a later time, there could be some minor changes made to the purchase and sale agreement. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is the purchase and sale agreement. So this top section up here, so lines 1 through 10, basically just identify what the property is. So you've got the parties involved. And because I originally put myself down as the buyer, that's why it's auto-populated my name here. So you've got the buyer, who the seller is. And to complete this top section, you're going to need to pull that information from the CRS tax records. So to do that, we're going to go into our Flex MLS. And I'm just going to pick up one of our listings. So I believe Corey has this one here on Horton Highway. So we'll just use that as an example. So it's asking me to log in. So this is what a property report will look like. And this property is currently pending. But to get to the CRS tax records, you're going to go up here to CRS tax info. That will redirect you to the tax report. So to find the seller name, you're going to find it under current owner, which is Ken Euchre. So that information will go here in the seller section. Now it's asking us all the tract of land known as, that will be the property address. So that is 13530 Horton Highway. And that is in Greenville. And the zip code is 37745. As recorded in Greene County Register of Deeds office. Now then, we need the deed book and the page numbers. That will be in the CRS tax records. So you're going to go down here to the sales history. You're going to look at the most recent sales history date. Here is the book, page, or document. So this is a perfect example. So the deed book is going to be this 576A. We'll go back here. 576A. The page is 2757. And then we've got this and or instrument number. So that is going to be this long set of numbers here. So the 16, we're going to copy that. We're going to paste that in here. So that takes care of the tax deed book, page, and instrument numbers. As further described as, this is where you're going to add the parcel ID number. You're going to go up here to the general parcel information, and this is the parcel ID. We're going to copy all of this. Copy back to the document. We're going to paste that in here. This is helpful and used by the title company to make sure that they've got the correct property. So the next section are the items that are included in the purchase. And you want to spend some time, read this carefully. So it's lines 12 through 22. These are all the different things that are already written into the contract. So you do not have to add those down here. The phrase I always like to use is anything nail glued and screwed all remain with the property. So any built-in kitchen appliances, window treatments. So just spend some time and make sure you're familiar with everything that is already included in the contract. If there is a garage door with an electronic opening system, you need to find out how many garage door openers there are and make sure you include those here. The next section is Part B, and it's other items that remain with the property at no additional cost to the buyer. So anything that's already written up here in Part A, you do not have to include here. So one of the more common ones that you may add to this section B would be the refrigerator. So we'll add the refrigerator in the kitchen. Even though it is an appliance, it is not considered a built-in appliance, so that's why we have to include the refrigerator. Items that shall not remain with the property. Kind of as a just a general rule of thumb that I like to always add is seller personal items. Part D is all about leased items. So in this area, some of the common ones that you'll run into will be propane tanks. You do see some water softener systems. It could be a security system, but these are things that are all leased and not specifically owned at the property. Then you also have this box here that, so if there is a leased item and the buyer does not want to take over that lease, then you can use this box here. Buyer does not wish to assume a leased item. So part E, if there is a propane tank on the property, the buyer chooses to keep that lease. This is directions for how the fuel will be dispersed. So fuel, if any, shall be adjusted and charged to buyer and credited to seller at closing at current market prices. So this is something that the title company will need to know about so that they can handle those funds. Line 30A, part 2 here is the purchase price and method of payment. So this whole section is going to be about purchase price and how the buyer is going to be paying for this property. So we're just going to come up with just a fake number. So we're going to say 200,000. And I just want to do this so you'll understand how to write this into the contract. And one thing you don't have to do is add the decimal and the two zeros. It'll automatically do it for you. So line 41, and this is set up to where it auto populates this for you. This is how you kind of always want to write. Anytime you're dealing with money, you want to write it out in numerical form, but then also write it out just like you would on a check. So we're going to go 200,000. The next section, part A here, is all about the financial contingency. So if they're using a loan, for example, if they're going to be putting down 20%, this would need to be 80. So you'll need to know that information beforehand. For this example, we're just going to say it's a conventional loan, but this is where you would add how are they financing this property. This is only for financing. So this is a financial contingency. If it's cash, it does not belong here. If they're doing a VA loan, you'll see this attach addendum. Also with an FHA loan, attach addendum. We'll get to that later. Line 63 through 84. Please spend some time and make sure that you understand this section very carefully. This goes over the loan obligations. The buyer agrees and or certifies as follows. Within 3 days after the binding agreement date, the buyer shall make application for the loan and shall pay for a credit report. Buyer shall immediately notify seller or seller's representative of having applied for the loan and provide lender's name and contact information, and that the buyer has instructed lender to order a credit report. Such certification shall be made via the notification form or equivalent written notice. So essentially, within 3 days of the binding accepted offer, you need to send a notification form with the lender's information and that they have ordered and paid for a credit report. Then line 68 here, the second part of that, within 14 days after the binding agreement date, buyer shall warrant and represent to seller via a notification form or equivalent written notice that A, the buyer has secured evidence of hazard insurance. The hazard insurance is basically homeowners insurance, which shall be effective at closing, and buyer shall notify seller of the name of the hazard insurance company. B, buyer has notified lender of an intent to proceed and has available funds to close per the signed loan estimate. And C, buyer has requested that the appraisal be ordered and affirms that the appraisal fee has been paid. So then 3 is buyer shall pursue qualification for and approval of the loan diligently and in good faith. Buyer shall continually and immediately provide requested documentation to lender and or loan originator. Unless otherwise stated in this agreement, buyer represents that this loan is not contingent upon the lease or sale of any other real property, and the same shall not be used as the basis for loan denial. Buyer shall not intentionally make any material changes in buyer's financial condition, which would adversely affect buyer's ability to obtain the primary loan or any other loan referenced herein. And then this section is very important to understand. Should buyer fail to timely comply with Section 2A1 or 2A2 above and provide notice as required, seller may make written demand for compliance via the notification form or equivalent written notice. If buyer does not furnish seller the requested documentation within 2 days after such demand for compliance, buyer shall be considered in default and seller's obligation to sell is terminated. So, what does all of this mean? So, here's where it gets tricky. Because it says via notification form or equivalent written notice, that means if the seller sends you an email requesting this information and it ends up in spam or just gets lost in your email and you don't see it, you've only got 2 days from the time that they send that email for you to comply with this. Otherwise, the seller can terminate this purchase and sell, and they would collect your buyer's earnest money because you defaulted on your obligations. So the next section, part B here, is the financing contingency waived. If it's a cash deal, then you would select this box, and then down here, this is how the buyer is going to furnish proof of funds. So this is typically like a bank statement or a lender's commitment letter. So a lender commitment letter would be like a letter from the bank stating that the buyer has sufficient cash funds to purchase the property. Section 99 is, so part C here, starts at line 99, is about the appraisal. So it's essentially, is this contingent on appraised value or is it not contingent? So line 1 is, this is not contingent on the appraised value. So that would be used for cash deals where the buyer is not going to have an appraisal. Since we're doing financing in this example, we're going to select 2 because this agreement is contingent upon the appraised value. Part D is the closing expenses. So line 144, where it's discussing title expenses, I always write in C lines 151 through 154. And then we're going to go down here to line 151. And this is where you've got some options. So if it's a straight, seller is going to pay the seller's closing cost and the buyer is going to pay the buyer's closing cost, that's how you would write it in. Seller to pay seller closing cost, buyer to pay buyer's closing cost, and prepaid expenses. Now, I want to go down here to this next line. So if the seller's paying the sellers and the buyer's paying the buyers, that's how you would write it in. If the buyer is going to request the seller to pay closing cost, then you'll do seller to pay seller closing costs, seller to pay, and we're going to use an example of 4%. So at 200,000 times 4%, that gives us 8,000. So we're going to say that the buyer is going to request the seller to pay up to $8,000. You always do it in numerical form and then you write it out. Of buyer's closing cost and prepaid expenses. So line 155 through 158 down here, this is for the closing company. And we always recommend using closed title. And also, if you go back and watch the video on back office, that training, at some point it'll ask you for who the title officer is. And if you add closed title to that, it will auto populate their information in here. Part 3 here at line 159 is about the earnest money. The buyer has paid or shall pay within. At Bridgepoint, we generally recommend 5 days after the bonding agreement date. 2, this will be closed title. I believe it's 3135 People Street. I can't remember what the suite number is. This is where you would put the title company's address. And this is where we add the amount of the earnest money deposit. So you really want this to be 1% of the purchase price, but you never want to go below 500. But it's a good rule of thumb to do at least 1%. So we're going to do 2,000. So we'll do 2,000 US dollars. This next section is just about failure to receive the earnest money. Next section is all about the handling of earnest money. And at Bridgepoint, we do not hold earnest money. We always give that to the title company. It's more of to limit the legal risk of us. So that way, if there's ever a dispute over the earnest money, it's out of our hands and it rests upon the title company. Line 190, here, part 4, is all about the closing date. So this is where you'll put the closing date in. You always want to do it especially if you're doing financing, you really want to do at least 30 days. So a 30-day close. So we'll go to the calendar. So today is October 11th. So we'll just do the 11th day of November. If it's a cash deal, you don't have to do 30 days. It is possible to do 14, but that's a discussion I would have with the title company first. And it's always good to have a discussion with the lender on how much time do they need to process this loan. Sometimes, especially if it's a government loan, sometimes those can get bogged down based on what's going on. So it's always a good idea to have a discussion with the lender and title company on coming up with a time frame for the closing date. The next section is possession. So 99% of the time, you're always going to check this box. At closing is evidenced by delivery of the warranty deed and payment of the purchase price. If for some reason they need temporary occupancy agreement before the closing date, you would use this section here. There's a lot of different ways to handle that, but most of the time you're going to do this at closing as evidenced by delivery. You can always do an amendment to the purchase and sale once it's under contract to handle any type of occupancy agreements. The next section here, C. So part B is just about the prorations. Part C is the green belt. So since we do live in a farming area, you will potentially run into some property that is 15 acres or more and could potentially qualify for a green belt. Basically, the green belt is a tax benefit to the buyer, but it does have some qualifications that the land has to meet in order to qualify for a green belt. Most of the time, this is not going to apply to most properties. Line 218 is special assessments. So any special assessments approved or levied prior to closing date shall be paid by the seller at or prior to closing unless otherwise agreed as follows. You got your warranties, transfer, association fees, title and conveyance, the deed. So this will be how the buyer wants their name on the deed. And if they want to include any other names on the deed. And you've got association lien payoff, public water or public sewer systems. Part 7 is your lead-based paint disclosure. So if a property was built prior to 1978, then there should be a lead-based paint disclosure attached. So it's either check this box if it does not apply or check this box if it does apply. Part 8 is all about the inspections. So you definitely, I'm not going to read this here, but you do want to spend some time and going through this inspection section. Part D is where you do your buyer inspection and resolution. So if your buyer wants to have a home inspection, which we always recommend, this is where you add that time frame. So we generally recommend 10 days for the home inspection. And then if you scroll on down, we get to our resolution period. So for the resolution period, we like to recommend 3 days. So what does all that mean? That means from the date and time that it is accepted and bound, so that acknowledgement of receipt is signed and dated and time stamped, you have 10 days to complete the home inspection, review the home inspection, find out if there are any items that the buyer wants to request the seller to fix or repair, write up the repair replace proposal, and submit that to the listing agent. All of that has to be completed within 10 days. As soon as the repair replace proposal is submitted, then you enter the resolution period. Now, let's say you've got 10 days to do the home inspection, but let's say you get the inspection report back in 5 days, write up the repair proposal, and submit that to the listing agent. As soon as that proposal is submitted, your inspection period ends immediately and you enter the resolution period. Then, based on this contract, you have X number of days. So, in this case, you've got 3 days to go back and forth with the seller and listing agent to negotiate those repairs and replacements. Once both parties come to an agreement, if there are items that need to be repaired and the seller agrees to repair those items, then you would do a repair replace amendment, which is signed by all parties, and the amendment then becomes part of the contract. So line 339, we do use this on occasion. So this box is used if the buyer wishes to have an inspection for informational purposes, but does not want to have a resolution period. So they are not going to be requesting any items to be repaired. They just want to know what's wrong with, if there's any issues with the property they should know about. Part E is if the buyer does not want to have any inspections whatsoever. So you would use this as a waiver of all inspections. So part 9 here is the completion of repairs. So whatever repairs you have all agreed upon, we go down here to 10, the final inspection. This is part of the final walkthrough. So we typically like to use 1 day minimum. So this means that basically the day before closing, all of the repairs that have been agreed upon have to be completed. And that is part of that final walkthrough that you'll do. Is one, you're making sure that the property is still in the condition that it was when you first went through the showing and made the offer, and to make sure that all the repairs and replacements that have been agreed upon have been completed, unless otherwise stated. Part 11 is the buyer's additional due diligence options. So you'll notice that survey is not part of the home inspection. Insurability is not part of your regular home inspection. Water supply, waste disposal, all of these are kind of their own separate inspections. When it comes to waste disposal, the septic system inspection letter can only be supplied by the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. Then again, you've got 12, which is part of your disclaimer. 13 is the brokerage. 14 is default. 15 is part of the home protection plan. So this is if the buyer wants to request a home protection plan, this is where that information would go. Most of the time, we choose not to do the home protection plan. We've got our other provisions. Terminology is a very good one to take some time and read and make sure you understand. It goes over the performance deadline and how the timeline works. The rest of these are just kind of spend some time and look at it, go over it. Then we get to part 20. These are your exhibits and addenda. So, for example, let's say that instead of a conventional loan, this was a VA or an FHA. Those loans require an attached addendum. So, a VA FHA addendum. This is where you would add those. So, FHA addendum. So, basically, your addenda and exhibits is anything you're attaching to the contract that is not already written into the contract. Another example is, let's say the property. So for this example, 13530 Horton Highway is already under contract. So let's say that this was part of a backup offer. There is a backup offer addendum. So we would add that. So any kind of special exhibits or addenda you need to add to this contract, that is where you will add that. Special stipulations you'll always use. This is where you will negotiate your commission unless otherwise specified by the listing agent. If you've had that conversation, they could do a compensation agreement instead. But if you don't know if the seller is offering commission to the buyer's agent, this is where you would add that. And the language I always like to use is seller to pay 2.5% or whatever percentage you want to negotiate on. But seller to pay 2.5% of the purchase price 2, Pointe Real Estate. 4, Buyer Agents Commission. So legally, your commission has to be processed through the brokerage. So the seller is to pay Bridgepoint, not you directly. Another example of special stipulations is in the event your buyer needs to sell their property in order to purchase this property, you would want to include that in special stipulations. So, just as an example for that, it would be something like contingent on the sale of 123 Main Street, Jonesboro, Tennessee. And then if it's what status or condition it's currently in. So if it's an active listing on the MLS, it would be good to say listed on whatever date it was listed with the MLS number for the listing agent. Or even better, if it's under contract, you do the same thing. Under contract with the closing date, the MLS number, all that sort of stuff, information. The more information you can provide, the stronger your offer is going to be. Then we get to line 515. This is the time limit of the offer. This is going to be kind of dependent on the property, the market, and any discussions you've had with the listing agent. A general rule of thumb is to do, usually, depending on what time it is, if you're writing it in the morning, you could do 11:59 p.m. the same day. Or you can do 24 hours. So 11:59 on the 12th day of October 2025. If it's a hot property that you feel is going to go very quick, then 3-4 hours is not out of the question. One thing to keep in mind is never do 12 o'clock because that can get kind of confusing at times for some people. So if you're going to do 12, I always like to do 11:59 a.m. or p.m. Then the final section is just where the buyer signs. And then we have our, for information purposes only. So you've got the selling company, Bridgepoint Real Estate, the address, firm license number, firm telephone number. It should automatically populate your information as well. So once the buyer signs, you would send this to the listing agent, and then the seller has the option to accept the offer, reject the offer, or they can counter the offer. So if they counter, they would check this counter box. and then they would proceed with a counter offer document. Once the document is accepted, so for this example, let's say you submit this to the listing agent, they accept it, they should send it back to you, and then you would sign this acknowledgement of receipt. This section is what binds the actual contract. So this acknowledgement of receipt has to be signed, dated, and time stamped. This date and timestamp is what initiates all of the performance deadlines set forth in the contract. So when the earnest money has to be turned in is based on this acknowledgement of receipt, date, and time. The 10-day home inspection is based off of this date and time. So this section is extremely important and must be completed. And that is the purchase and sale agreement.